Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, our old pal Zach Osterman from the Indianapolis Star is back to help us talk about IU basketball here as we continue to move through the summer and toward the season. It's a wide-ranging conversation. We talk about Indiana's massive recruiting budget, the 2020 recruiting class. We talk about the recent article in Indianapolis Monthly about the job Fred Glass is doing as AD. And then we talk about Mike Roberts, the name that a lot of people have been hearing is in the lead for the open assistant coaching position. And we close with a few questions looking ahead to next basketball season. So a fun, wide-ranging conversation with Zach. We hope you enjoy it here on Podcast on the Brink. And now here is our conversation with Zach Osterman. All right, and we are joined now on Podcast on the Brink by the great Zach Osterman, IU beat writer for the Indianapolis Star, host of the Mind Your Banners podcast. Zach, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. Always great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me back. The season must be approaching if I'm back on Podcast on the Brink.
It is quickly approaching. So I want to start off by addressing a piece that you guys published earlier this week about the recruiting budget, titled Indiana Basketball Might Not Be Back Among the Nation's Elite, but it sure spends like it. And, one of the lines in there on Indiana's recruiting budget, you say the Hoosiers never ranked outside the nation's top six in expenses over the aforementioned 6-year period. I believe that was from 2013 to 2018. 3 times in that span, Indiana topped the list, including in 2018. The first question I want to ask you about that, just so everybody kind of understands, how exactly are those expenses broken down? I mean, I assume that the majority of it is travel expenses, but what all is comprised in there in the recruiting budget?
Yeah, to kind of give some background on this to start, and I pulled the numbers up. Basically, that story was something that I was asked to put together as part of a larger sort of look that the Louisville Courier-Journal was doing at recruiting expenses. And I think it basically, in talking with Louisville, I think that it started to just sort of be confined to like basketball and football recruiting at local schools. And then it just kind of kept expanding in the way that stories sometimes just can kind of blow up on you without you realizing that they do. And then Steve Berkowitz, who's a USA Today database reporter, he's the guy who marshals all of those online college athletics finances databases that people like to comb through, the coaching salaries and things like that. And Berko, I've known Berko for probably 10 years. He's as smart as it comes when you talk about this kind of stuff. And basically it just kind of exploded until it got to be a much bigger thing. So in writing that story, it wasn't meant to be some weird kind of like, oh, look at Indiana, look at what they're doing here. This isn't the first time we've written about recruiting expenses. Last year I wrote a story about men's basketball spending writ large, and recruiting was just a part of that. So we've written about it before. We'll probably write about it again. The numbers come from the annual reports that every NCAA member has to file with the association. And basically the NCAA, and this is going back maybe 15 years now, and this is probably more background than anybody needs, but I think it's important to kind of understand where all this comes from. The NCAA 10 or 15 years ago decided that it wanted a better idea, a better snapshot of where and how its member schools were spending money. There's something called the EADA report, which every school has to file with the Department of Education every year. But it is incredibly lax in the ways in which it requires schools to categorize money, and schools can move money around basically however the hell they want within the confines of the EADA report. It's useful for a small number of things, but it's not very specific. And so the NCAA sat down and tried to come up with this like uniform report that it's actually managed to edit and kind of hone over the years to try and get schools school's budget items as narrowly defined as possible so that it can say, all right, we're, with a level of confidence that when a school reports this much money here, that is actually accurate, and they're not just pulling money and moving it around to make it look like they're spending more on one thing or less on another thing and so on. It doesn't break it down beyond, to your question, just saying that the lowest level it breaks it down is to go into, I think there's either 18 or 19 categories in each revenues and expenses. And the lowest level it breaks it down is to go into each of those categories and break it down by sport. So it doesn't break down what Indiana spent this recruiting money on. It doesn't say X amount was on meals, X amount was on hotels, X amount was on travel, etc. It just says that this is the amount of money that Indiana spent on recruiting. This is the amount of money that Indiana spent on basketball recruiting specifically versus football recruiting versus women's basketball recruiting, volleyball recruiting, et cetera, and so forth. Now, I can tell you that in 2015, my former colleague Mark Alicia wrote a lengthy story about Indiana's, because at that time, that was another year, I think, where Indiana was number one in the country in recruiting, or it was either number one in the country or number one in the Big Ten in recruiting spend. And Mark basically just asked, like, where's all this money going? And the big thing that had changed from Indiana's perspective is that IU used to have university planes that the coaches could use for recruiting, university jets. And my understanding was always that athletics did not pay for those. It could use those. The university effectively subsidized the cost. And there is a line item in those NCAA reports for like money that the university covers for the department. Like, for example, and I know I'm getting totally into the weeds with this here. I promise I'm winding toward a conclusion. But like a good example is if the lights go out at Assembly Hall, then then Fred Glass or whoever is going to call university maintenance and support. The athletics department doesn't have, and it would make a lot of sense for the athletics department to maintain its own, facilities maintenance staff, its own electricians, its own, plumbers and those sorts of things. And so the university landscaping is another one. The university, I think, covers a lot of that kind of stuff. And so then the athletics has to kind of break out a budget item for this is the amount of money that, the university more or less paid for us in the form of services that we do not render ourselves. The planes were like that. The university paid for the storage, the upkeep, the fuel, the pilots, all that. Athletics just used them. IU got rid of those planes a few years ago and started chartering every flight. They found out that it would be cheaper for the university long term. And effectively that has changed the amount of money that Indiana spends on recruiting, because all of a sudden the athletics department has to pay for charter flights. So that's one area, one example of kind of where the recruiting inflation spending can come from. But the reports themselves don't break that down, kind of line item by line item. Sorry, I know that was way more than everybody was looking for.
No, but that was really useful context. So resources are one thing, and I think all Indiana fans have to be encouraged that the commitment of resources is there. I mean, clearly, Fred Glass, Indiana basketball, willing to spend like the elite of the elite. But, results are another thing. And, we all know what the results of the program have been over the last 6 years. And even, in the last couple of years, the recruiting results specifically have been good. Maybe you could even classify them as really good, but they haven't been at that Kentucky, Duke, Kansas, UNC level, which is obviously the one that, as Fred Glass even said himself, that he compares Indiana basketball to. And I'm curious why you think that is. Is it as simple as Indiana not winning enough recently to have the same national pull as those schools? Because, the resource investment is the same, or is there something deeper there?
I think as with a lot of things you talk about with recruiting, I think that there's no one answer. I think that certainly it doesn't help that from, Indiana's perspective, when you talk about the current college or current high school senior, I mean, he was born so a guy who is going to graduate in 2020, let's assume he's 18. He was born in 2002. So he was born 15 years after the last time Indiana won a national championship. He's not even old enough to remember the 02 Final Four run. And if you look at, and I've written stories about this, other people have written stories about this, if you break out things like Big Ten titles in that time, draft picks in that time, and so on and so on, Indiana actually really hasn't been terribly relevant from a conference perspective. I think I'd have to go back and look at these numbers. I've got them in a spreadsheet somewhere, but I think it's something like over the last 20 years, Indiana's got the fifth or sixth best winning percentage in the Big Ten. And that's overall winning percentage. That's Big Ten specific winning percentage. I think they were right ahead of Michigan, and Michigan is probably about to overtake them. We don't know, obviously, what will happen with Juwan Howard taking over for John Beilein, but certainly Beilein had them on course to overtake Indiana, I think, like next year, basically. So that's always going to be part of it. I think that from the perspective of the current staff, listen, Archie Miller's a young coach, and I think that there's a lot about Archie Miller that seems to resonate on the recruiting trail. I think you see that in the success that he has had already, particularly in state and in this region. But at the same time, when you think about, for example, what really turned recruits on to Tom Crean, it was his history of developing players and sending players to the NBA, among other things. But that was a really big part of it. Archie Miller doesn't have that yet. And so when you're sitting here and trying to talk about, well, what would make Indiana more appealing? What would make Archie Miller more appealing? I think part of it would be just the ability to sell kind of how would I put this? Not a brighter future, but the ability to kind of offer some assurance to elite young prospects to say, hey, you come here and we'll get you better. Romeo Langford going in the lottery helps. I know there are also probably some people that feel like Romeo Langford having the season he had last year, maybe being a little bit disappointing, whether you think he was disappointing or not, that may not help as much, but this kind of currency is always a moving, shifting thing. And I think that some of it, if Archie Miller just kind of has the time to build his brand at Indiana, find ways to, really kind of enhance his own sort of resume in terms of developing players, that'll play a big part in kind of improving things in the future. But I think there is also just undeniably, listen, Indiana is going to keep spending at an elite level from a facilities perspective, a contracts perspective, budgets, whatever. But you can't just buy a brand. You can't just buy the level of clout that a Duke has or that a Kansas has. And Indiana's brand is already certainly well ahead of where almost anybody else is, from the perspective of just college basketball at large. But if Indiana expects to be competing with Kansas, with Duke, with UNC, that's the kind of thing that just has to be earned over time. It just cannot happen because you have the biggest X budget or you spend the most money on Y over a 5-year period. That's important, don't get me wrong, but that's not going to get it done by itself.
Zach, the 2020 recruiting class obviously has 2 commits at this point. Trey Galloway, who committed, I think, July 26th, and then Anthony Leal 2 weeks later, the Bloomington South guard. So Indiana's, they're on the board in 2020, but I think one of the interesting things about this class, and I think we've discussed this a little bit, Archie Miller's first full recruiting cycle in Bloomington, he had that 5-star kid in state that he could go after in Romeo Langford. He got him. Last year's class, he had multiple 5-star kids, Trace Jackson Davis and Keon Brooks. He got one of the two, which, that's in my opinion, doing your job. I mean, you're not going to get every top kid. The 2020 class is unique in that while there are several, Division I high major type players in the state, there's not that 5-star type kid. So I'm curious from your perspective, obviously having Leal and Galloway in the fold is a good start, but what do you look for in this class if you're the IU coaching staff to kind of put a barometer on whether it's been successful? Is it just filling specific needs? Is there a certain position or certain type of player you think they need to get to consider this successful?
Well, I think in terms of positions, I think there are needs that are as clearly kind of delineated by who Archie Miller's offered as anything else. I mean, I think it's very clear that the staff wants a point guard in this class, for example, and I think it would be fair to say that this class won't be complete unless or until it has one. Just based on who Archie Miller has, prioritized, and I don't know that necessarily IU is going to get one of the guys specifically that's already on the board, et cetera, but just based on who IU has made a priority out of recruiting, you can draw some assumptions about, what Archie Miller feels he needs in this class. And I think that's probably one of them is that point guard spot. I think more broadly, I mean, you talk about IU being off the board. I think that's important for Indiana in this class because it's not obvious where Indiana goes next, and I don't know yet if that's a good or a bad thing. I've always been hesitant to make sort of like unequivocal statements about recruiting because things can shift and change, and you don't know what factors can suddenly become in play that maybe weren't even 6 months ago or 2 months ago or whatever. I can find you guys where I was convinced that Indiana was probably the team to beat. And then I can also find you guys, and then they wound up going somewhere else. I can also find you guys that it didn't make any sense to me why Indiana would be the choice. And then circumstances change. I think everybody just sort of assumed Thomas Bryant, for example, was going to stay close to home and go to Syracuse. Then all of a sudden Syracuse gets hit with these really big NCAA penalties. And Thomas Bryant's recruitment is wide open because so many other teams by that point had kind of walked away figuring, well, this is just not worth the time. Let's go find someone else. And then all of a sudden, Indiana is in the catbird seat. And I'm not saying that Indiana wasn't a good fit for Thomas Bryant or that Indiana didn't work hard for Thomas Bryant, but all of a sudden, Indiana maneuvering itself in a recruitment where maybe a lot of people assumed nobody had a shot outside of Syracuse pays off in a big way relatively quickly. I mean, that happened in terms of kind of Thomas Bryant going from being a name on a recruiting board somewhere, my recruiting board anyway, or Alex, your recruiting board, to being a guy that you felt like, wow, he's a really, really serious target for Indiana. This is accelerating at pace. This is going to be a really big get for Indiana if they can pull it off. I mean, that was just a couple months maybe. And you just don't know how quickly those things can move and shake and change. And I think that from IU's perspective, it is hard to kind of know exactly where they go next. Again, I think point guard is a serious want. I don't know, beyond Caleb Love, who's confirmed an official visit. I don't know who else maybe Indiana's going to be able to lure to campus, get really serious with going into the fall. There also seems to be a desire for a big man potentially, but then you also see Indiana still involved in Matt Cross's recruitment, and Matt Cross, at least by what I've seen of him, is much more of kind of a stretch forward, a wing type player. You also have Jordan Geronimo, who's taking an official visit reportedly here at the end of the month. My point is, I think it's kind of hard to peg where Indiana goes next, and I think it's important that they've got Leal and Galloway on the board, partly for that reason, because just quite frankly, you want to make sure you're at least addressing some of this and you're at least addressing some needs. And I think both of those guys do. This gives Indiana a little bit of leeway to miss on a couple guys potentially, and also to spend some time really focusing on getting, just a small list of players that they really want to prioritize. So I think I know that that's kind of a shaky answer, but I think right now, at least my read of the landscape is that it's hard to know exactly where Indiana goes next in recruiting in this class specifically.
I think, Zach, one of the questions that you and I could be asked sooner rather than later on Twitter or via email or whatever avenue that fans reach out to us as they like to and ask questions, which I know we both enjoy getting those questions most of the time. But I saw ESPN today, and they're probably, in my opinion, one of the they're not who I look to first for recruiting rankings. Let's just say that. There's some people over there that I really respect that do a good job, and there's also some that I don't necessarily put a lot of stock in what they have to say. But they updated their rankings today for the 2020 class, and the highest ranked Indiana kid they had was Nijel Pack. And it's interesting that you mentioned point guard being a position of need. Do you think, in hindsight, that we're going to look back? And I know you saw Nijel Pack with the Indiana Junior All-Stars down here in Louisville. You came to one of the exhibition games that we watched. In hindsight, do you think that's going to be something that Indiana looks at as a missed opportunity with Nijel Pack based on what you saw and what you know of him?
It could be. And, I talked to a couple people that sort of basically told me that they felt Indiana would wind up maybe regretting not getting more serious with him. And obviously Pack also, it was interesting to me when he committed that he kind of took himself off the board before July, and then it seemed like he had, and I wasn't at Peach Jam, I was down in Hoover. I was at the Adidas Gauntlet Championships, but it seemed like Pack had a huge July. So it's kind of interesting to me that he decided to kind of end his recruitment that early and maybe not leave it open for July and leave open the possibility of going to Peach Jam and turning some heads. But nevertheless, from IU's perspective, they might wind up feeling that way. I mean, I don't think you can guarantee right now that they won't. I think, the one thing I'll say is you can't get every kid in state. And I know that fans want every kid in state, and I know fans certainly lament when in-state kids go elsewhere and succeed. I think the best you can do is hope that you're making the right evaluations and just try to have the greatest confidence that you can place in your staff, in your ability to kind of peg not only your needs, but why certain players fit you and other players don't. This isn't to say that Indiana is going to wind up right or wrong on Nijel Pack. I know, Alex, I believe you're pretty high on him. I saw him. I was impressed with what I saw in Indiana All-Stars. I probably would put a little more stock in what just kind of other people have told me of Nijel Pack more broadly, just because I only saw him in a couple of all-star appearances. And those games can be a little bit hit and miss in terms of really giving you an idea of a player's skill set. But I would not be surprised if he turns into the kind of player that Indiana wishes down the line it had. But I also just think at some level you can't. I think one of the more dangerous things that you could do is start playing woulda, coulda, shoulda. And I don't mean that within a fan base. I think that's just natural for fans. But I mean that within a staff. I think when you start really worrying about the road less traveled, the road not traveled, whatever, you're kind of taking your eye off the ball. I mean, and this isn't about basketball. This is about kind of everything in sports. Like, coaching is kind of a little bit like snake oil sales. Like you kind of have to fake it till you make it a little bit. And more than anything, I think really you have to have the ability and the confidence to believe so deeply in yourself that your confidence is almost unshakable. And because there will be so many people that doubt you, and there will be so much external sort of chatter and pressure and noise. And you've just got to believe that what you're doing is going to be right. And that, hey, every once in a while, everybody gets one wrong. Everybody misses. Everybody, makes a mistake they wishes they could have back. But at the end of the day, you are confident in the aggregate in your overall ability to get those kinds of decisions right. And so I think that really it would probably be more worrying, and I don't know that we'd ever really know this empirically, but I think it would be more worrying if you got somebody like Archie Miller sitting there thinking, oh my, in 2 years, oh wow, I screwed up huge on Nijel Pack. I just think that once that train has sailed, let it go. Because when you start losing confidence in your own system and your own process and all that is when I think you can get into some real trouble.
Zach, the other big story right now that Indiana fans are paying attention to is the open assistant coach position, which has felt like it's been open forever.
Yeah.
And that has just led to so much speculation, so much talk, more so than I can ever really remember for an open assistant coach position. But it's been really tight-lipped. We haven't heard much about it, but now we're finally starting to hear a name, former Hoosier Mike Roberts. Now, as we record this on Wednesday morning, nothing is official, so we don't know, what the final outcome of this will be. But we are at least kind of finally starting to hear a name. What are your thoughts right now on that open position and the name Mike Roberts that we're hearing is clearly a serious candidate for the job?
Yeah, Roberts specifically is interesting, and things really do seem to be pointing that way. And frankly, I think probably have been for the last couple of days. Number one, it's not surprising to me that not necessarily that it's taken this long, but that it's been so quiet. I think if there's one thing that we've learned about Archie Miller from, sort of a program news perspective, he doesn't share a lot with people. It's not his way. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If anything, listen, I'm a reporter. I always want more information, but I think if anything, if you're an IU fan, you would much rather have the coach who doesn't act anything out in the media, who doesn't, constantly just sort of like play the league game and constantly try to get, a little bit more attention, just a little bit more, just pull that little extra bit of juice out of the news cycle. I think it's better, frankly, when you're just saying, hey, just let this we're going to take care of our business and we're not going to worry about what goes on outside of that. And so it's not surprising to me that there's not been a lot of talk around it. I think that from the perspective of Mike Roberts as a candidate, I think there are some ways in which it makes sense. Not just I've never been a believer in hire an IU guy for IU guy's sake, but I think I've always believed that it should be a plus if there are other reasons to consider a guy like that. I think you look at, he's credited with developing a number of big men in particular, guys who are all conference players, a couple guys who wound up in the NBA draft. The one thing that's interesting to me is, and this could be a good thing, this could be a bad thing, you just don't know. He's beyond playing at Indiana, and that's an important part of his kind of experience. But he's never been at a big program as a head coach. I think that's the one thing that I'd look like, or not as a head coach, but as an assistant coach. He's kind of moved. He's been at Rice, Cal. He was a GA at Texas Tech under Bob Knight. And then obviously he would be coming potentially from UNC Greensboro if this does kind of prove to be true, and to bear out. His experience as a player at Indiana, I think, would help him a lot in that regard. But as a coach, it's still just, hey, how do you operate when everybody, like places like Indiana worry a lot more, for example, about who's on staff than I think your average college fan base. I don't think that's something that a lot of college fan bases worry about is, who are our assistants and why? Like, why is he on staff instead of this other person, and so on and so forth. I think that's something that is not necessarily unique to Indiana, but is distinct to a small number of programs, including Indiana, if that makes any sense. And so you just got to be prepared to operate in that fishbowl a little bit. And again, I think his time as a player will probably help him in that regard, knowing this fan base, knowing Bloomington, because I think that's something else that can happen is if you've never lived in that small college town where everybody knows who you are and everybody's passionate and everybody's invested, that can sneak up on you a little bit as well. But it'll just be interesting to see kind of how he adjusts and also how he fits in under Archie Miller. This is Archie's first hire since he put his initial staff together. And, when he put that first staff together, there was very much a feeling of, hey, these are all guys that are buying into kind of Archie Miller's long-term vision for IU. And, they're really here for the long haul or whatever you want to say. This is a guy this is the first time Archie's kind of gone outside I don't want to say the family, but outside just that broader sort of idea of, okay, this is, I have to go back into the market and the assistant coaching market and find somebody to fill a hole, sort of midstream in my rebuilding process, if you will. It'll just be interesting to see how that works out as well.
Zach, there was an interesting piece, and I linked it on Twitter, I think yesterday, and also on our Facebook page. And it'll also be linked here in the show notes, in Indianapolis Monthly on Fred Glass. And, I thought the headline, which I don't know who writes the headlines there, was a little misleading, in that, it was titled "A Season on the Brink for Fred Glass." But if you actually read the article, it was, a pretty fair, I think, discussion just kind of on the broader job that Fred has done in his time in Bloomington. A lot of talk about the improvements that he's made to facilities, a lot of talk about the sports other than basketball and football, which, I think a lot of times, those are obviously the big money makers, the most well-attended events, but sometimes I think we forget about some of the other sports that have thrived in recent years. But I'm just kind of curious, one, did you get a chance to read that? And two, how, I guess, should fans judge, and this not specifically to Indiana, but, I know you've covered college athletics for a long time now and are familiar with other athletic departments around the country. But ultimately, I guess, in your opinion, how should fans judge the performance of an athletic director? Is it as simple as saying, hey, men's basketball is not where it needs to be, so the job that's being done is not acceptable? Or are there other things that you feel are maybe sometimes overlooked when people evaluate these types of things?
Yeah, I read the article. I mean, I sort of skimmed it, I think the way everybody reads anymore online, but I thought it was fair. And I guess, full disclosure, the author, Craig Fearman, I don't know him super well, but he does have me on to talk to a class he teaches at IU pretty regularly. I don't think that would change anyone's perspective of my objectivity about his objectivity, but it's probably worth just mentioning. But I thought it was, personally, I thought it was fair. And I think that I don't want to put words in Fred Glass's mouth, but I'm guessing Fred would probably think it was fair, at least to a point. Like, I think Fred would be the first to acknowledge that football and men's basketball are his two money makers. And that's both in the literal sense and the figurative sense. And neither of them is where in, what is this, Fred's 10th year? This will be the end of Fred's 10th year on the job. Or maybe even no, I guess 11th year technically. Neither of them is where Fred would want them to be, where the fans want them to be, et cetera. And that ultimately an athletic director is going to bear the brunt of that kind of disappointment first and foremost. I think Fred would also probably, as somebody who's covered all of Fred's tenure, I think he'd also be pleased, for lack of a better term, to kind of see the things that were cited in that article as his quote unquote successes. So, like, for example, the Student Athlete Bill of Rights, all of the capital improvements projects that IU Athletics has completed in the last, 10 years, the complete basically remaking of the face of the athletics campus. And, I think critics would point to it and say, well, he got all this Big Ten Network money and, it would be hard to sort of fail under those conditions ever. Yes, but the reality is the Big Ten Network money, I think, has really allowed for increased spending and things like coaching salaries. That the capital improvements projects have largely come in big donations and fundraising and things like that. The Big Ten Network has, I think, closed a lot of holes for those capital projects. But Fred's fundraising has also been a really important part of that as well. Again, I think it was just broadly fair. I don't think that you can sit here and say that, Indiana is in a perfect place as a department there, especially from an athletic success perspective. There have been some good moments. I mean, he gets Indiana back to he hires the coach that gets Indiana to back-to-back bowl games for the first time since the early 90s and so forth. But I think there are also things where you'd look at it and say, by this point in his tenure, it would be fair to wonder why some of this wasn't more consistent, why some results weren't more consistent. And so I'm guessing even Fred would find a lot of elements of that piece to be fair. If, he might qualm with some of them and maybe pick along the edges in some places. But my guess is he would probably look at a lot of that and say, at least of what I read of it, and say, you know what, I can see the truth in, a decent bit of this.
Zach, I want to close with a couple of questions looking ahead to next basketball season, which is going to be here before we know it. As you look ahead to this upcoming year's team, besides Jerome Hunter's health, which is obviously a huge question that has hung over this entire offseason and will until we have some clarity on it, what are the 2 or 3 biggest questions in your mind that are going to determine how good Indiana is this season?
Good question. I think number one would be just how ready Rob Finney is to kind of be the guy at point guard. I mean, I think we all pretty much expect him to be the man at that position, to be a leader, to be a floor general, to be all of those cliches. But just how ready is he? I mean, is he ready to just absolutely take over that position, be the guy that runs everything for Indiana, 2 hands on the wheel, tucking in every curve, driving down every straightaway, whatever other racing metaphors you want to torture there, I apologize. Because he is still only a sophomore, and I think that's important to remember. He had a great freshman season, but he is still only a sophomore. I think certainly you're always going to wonder about 3-point shooting. I think Jerome Hunter comes into that a little bit, but I think you also can Al Durham be a little bit more consistent there. Can Javonte Green really kind of put up, instead of being maybe a little bit of a streakier player, can he be a guy that puts up those high level numbers? We've seen him shoot, kind of over short periods, maybe a month or two during his career. Can he put together an entire season of that? Are there other guys that can help in that? Maybe an Armand Franklin or DeMazie Anderson. And then I think the other big thing for me is, how does Indiana try to leverage its size advantage? I mean, this is a team that's got, depending on how Archie Miller wants to put guys on the floor, as many as 5 legitimate options for the 4 and 5 spots. You've got Deron Davis, Race Thompson, Joey Brunk, Justin Smith, and Trace Jackson Davis. I don't think I'm forgetting anybody there. And you can flex Justin Smith to the 3 if you want to go big. And, we'll see how much more versatile Trace Jackson Davis can be in that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, what Indiana's got on that roster is the ability to create matchup problems down low with anybody. I think that's something Archie Miller really wanted last year and just never was really able to get, because Deron Davis's health, because obviously of Race Thompson's health, because neither Clifton Moore nor Jake Forrester kind of came along in the ways that probably Indiana would have hoped they would. So I think that from that perspective, that's maybe the biggest matchup question I have about Indiana is, how do they really leverage that size advantage to maybe compensate if they can't shoot the 3 ball terribly well, or if they struggle to find, consistent scoring from their backcourt. They've got to turn that on other people, if that makes any sense. Like they've got to try and turn that advantage on somebody else and make that somebody else's problem, rather than necessarily saying, well, we've got to figure out how to deal with the problems they're creating for us. Sometimes the way you do that, the way that you say, offense is the best form of defense sometimes, is before somebody else can create that problem for you, you create a different problem for them. And that gets them kind of on the back foot, and that gets them, dealing with a difficult, sort of a difficult question that maybe they're not prepared to answer. And I think that the best way Indiana's going to be able to do that, quite frankly, is by really, really trying to leverage that size advantage. And I want to see how Archie Miller tries to do that.
Interesting. So that you may have just answered the last question that I wanted to ask you, which is there, look, I think it's pretty easy to look at some of the holes on next year's roster and kind of think about what this team has been the last couple of years and paint a pessimistic outlook for next season. But are there some reasons for optimism that you think not enough people are paying attention to? And maybe, what you said right there about the advantage Indiana could potentially have down low, maybe that's one of them. What maybe would some others be?
Yeah, the size advantage is undoubtedly one. I've jokingly referred to it as the Tom Izzo rule of always having one more big man than you need. It feels like no matter what happens to Tom Izzo's post rotation, there's always some 6'9" guy ready to come in and give him 7 really good games that see Michigan State through some kind of injury crisis. I think that the other big one, and this is from a Rob Finney perspective, I wouldn't underrate the value of Indiana having a settled point guard situation for the first time in 3 years? I mean, effectively 4 years if you're talking about the preseason. The last time that we went into a preseason, looking at an Indiana team and saying, this is who the unquestioned, starting point guard is going to be. This is what they can expect from him. These are his undeniable strengths, and this is how he can affect the fortunes of this team. Was when Yogi Ferrell was a senior, and that's with all respect to Josh Newkirk. But even when you knew Newkirk was probably kind of the starter, the reality is Newkirk was still a somewhat unproven commodity. Indiana couldn't say with certainty this is what we have in Josh Newkirk because they just hadn't seen him in that setting before. And I think what we found out over time was that Newkirk was a good player who probably had just had some things taken away by injuries that he just couldn't get back physically. And that was, I think that's always hard to kind of watch young guys go through. But generally speaking, I think that there's a real advantage in being able to know that your point guard situation is settled and done and over. And you just say, Rob Finney, when healthy, is our number one point guard, and we can spoke out from there in whatever directions that we need to. We can build the depth around him. We can build the rotations around him. When do we play Devontae Green as sort of a second point guard? When do we deploy Devontae Green as more of a shooting guard? What do we do with Al Durham? What do we expect from, this guy, or this guy? I just think that Indiana hasn't had that kind of advantage in a long time. And I wouldn't underestimate how valuable it is to just be able to say, this is Indiana's point guard. No questions, no problems. It's all done.
Awesome, Zach. Thank you for your time. Follow him on Twitter at Zach Osterman. Read his work at the Indianapolis Star. Pay for a subscription to the Indianapolis Star. And be on the lookout for the next Mind Your Banners, which I always look forward to listening to. Thanks, Zach. We appreciate your time, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, as always.
Thanks, Zach.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.